And we have attendees coming in. Welcome, everybody. This is what I'll do is I'll share my screen. Welcome, everybody. We are getting the participants in. I will give it another 1 minute before we actually start. You're very welcome at this webinar of the innovation series of Blink Innovation. We're actually going to look at genetic engineering and the future of genetic engineering, or at least we're going to share some thoughts around that subject. Participants are still coming in, so please bear with us to give everybody a chance to find a seat, which is probably most probably behind your own computer. Again, a welcome for the participants that just joined the innovation series on genetic engineering and how genetic engineering can be used and should be used, will be used, can be used in the future. I'm just looking at my colleague, Katie. Katie, shall I start? I'm getting a thumbs up, so that means we are going to start. Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to innovation series organized by Blink Innovation. Today we're going to talk about a really topical issue or topical subject called genetic engineering and its role that it will have, the role that it has currently, and the role that it could play in the future of New Zealand. We have two wonderful guest speakers, and but I will introduce them a little bit later on in my introduction, and then I will actually I will introduce them a little bit later, and then you can hear all from them. Before we start with that, I want to introduce B-Link Innovation to you. B-Link Innovation is a business unit of Lincoln University, and we basically do three things. We try to connect people. So one of the things that we're doing is we are organizing events, and this is one of these events that we organize, where we actually bring people together. So hopefully when people come together, they will start talking to each other, and hopefully that discussion will lead into a collaboration. With that collaboration, we really believe that if you start to talk to people and start to work with people, that brings synergies to your project or your challenge, you will actually start to innovate. So those are the three things that we're doing, and we do that through events like this one. But we also have a co-working space on the Lincoln campus, and where we have wonderful companies actually utilizing this innovation space. A little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded, and you will all receive an email of this. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function, and you can actually put questions in there. At the end of the session, so after both John and Ian have talked, we will actually go through the Q&As, and we'll see how many questions we have time for to answer. You as a participant, you guys are all muted. So please use the chat function or the Q&A function to actually put in your questions. Well, I already said, well, let's get involved with the discussion. If you want to do that, please use the social media channels to actually connect to us. Well, without further ado, let's start with this webinar, and where we're actually going to explore genetic engineering, and genetic engineering in the role and the place it has in the future of New Zealand. A lot of things have happened, like we have been breeding in the egg food space for quite a long time, and we bred some through just classical breeding. We got some wonderful advances. At the moment, we are faced with some issues or some challenges in our environment, moving to sustainability, etc., where technology can really give us an answer and help us to move forward even quicker. One of these technologies could be genetic engineering, and so that's why we want to talk about that today. With that all being said, I really want to introduce our first speaker, John McEwen from Egg Research. And John has been doing a lot of work in genetic and genome improvement in sheep. That's where his career started. And then he looked at disease resistance, but on one side, but on the other side, also looking at yield improvement through meat and carcass quality improvements. Then I'll jump a little bit in time. At the moment, he is focusing on looking at low-cost genotyping by looking at different sequencing methodologies. I think everybody now is very well aware what sequencing is doing because we're using it with the COVID space. And also he is looking at how this can help us as well with potential methane reduction. So without any further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I will give John the floor.
Thanks. I'll share my screen now. Hopefully everybody can see the slides. So I want to talk today about genetic engineering in New Zealand. So the short answer is yes, we are genetic engineering in New Zealand is already there. It's being used for research use, but particularly we're using the products of the genetic engineering technology in New Zealand. However, GE spans a wide range of activities and methods. It can be used for research and containment. It can be part of the production of imported products like vaccines or enzymes or food. But there's also a component where we actually release genetically engineered microbes, plants, or animals into New Zealand. In my opinion, New Zealand needs to utilize this technology to better address some of its most pressing issues. And these can be summarized down to invasive species, lower greenhouse gas emission agriculture, better and faster adaptation to climate change and disease, and also new biological industries that are coupled with lower resource use of, say, nitrogen fertilizers, phosphate, water, and energy. There's a new style CRISPR gene editing technology that can target changes, and it can do two things. It can either speed up combining variants that are already present in nature, and as such, regulation in New Zealand should be modified to be more in line with our overseas markets. And those targeted changes can be either single mutations, which we'll discuss later, or deletions or additions. And in my opinion, it's time for a sensible discussion to commence, because New Zealand is facing a number of disruptive challenges to our major exports. So who am I? Well, I'm a researcher for over 40 years, mainly in sheep and now many other species. I've been involved in sheep improvement for host resistance to disease, reproduction, meat quality and quantity, and more recently, methane emissions. In my area, lamb meat productivity, that's kilograms of lamb meat per ewe, has increased 116% since 1990, while its environmental impact, that's in CO2 equivalents, has decreased by 31% per tonne of production. And because the production's about the same, that means its actual environmental footprint is decreased as well. And genetics is really one of the major contributors to that change. Not the only one, but one of the major contributors. And I've seen the transformation over my career in sheep breeding from primarily visual selection to using pedigree and recorded traits properly. And it's essentially matrix arithmetic that uses the pedigree of the animals, to nowadays genomic selection, which uses DNA variants instead of pedigree. And my career has included the sequencing of the cattle, the sheep, and the deer genomes, and also investigating several major variants of DNA variants that affect sheep production. So what's genetic engineering? Genetic engineering is also called genetic modification or genetic manipulation, and it's the direct manipulation of an organism's genes using biotechnology methods. It's a wide field. There's many methods, including newer targeted methods like CRISPR gene editing. These are simply technological variants, but they're more specific and precise than natural mutational processes that occur. And we've got two outcomes. We can either combine existing variants more rapidly into a single organism, so speeding up what's called introgression, or we can introduce new variants that may or may not exist in nature to provide new functions. And we've got some products and outcomes. So products include food, clothing, plastics, biological products like enzymes, vaccines, and antibodies, or you can have altered microbes, fungi, or plants or animals released into the environment and contributing hopefully to better welfare and fewer diseases. The diagrams here I just really want to show is that we are basically modifying bits of DNA. This is a picture of DNA. And when we're talking about CRISPR, what we're really talking about is targeting a specific region and changing that region through a series of enzymatic reactions. Do I use genetic engineering? And the answer is no, but it's got a caveat or two. So in my career, we've managed to accelerate genetic progress in sheep by about 70% using introduction of BLUP technology, starting around 25 or 30 years ago and being implemented fully by about 2004. And then since that time, we've potentially got another 50 to 100% increase on top of that via genomic selection. Now that's just being able to better rank animals that are produced naturally by looking at their DNA. And it's improved particularly valuable but difficult to measure traits like disease resistance. However, most of the enzymes that we use for sequencing and genotyping are produced by genetic engineering and they're imported into the country. We here in New Zealand all eat many products, most likely containing components that are produced by GE. In my research, I have used cloned DNA, so in other words, GE products, to sequence some of the sheep genome, but that was inside the lab. So a little bit of background. We've got DNA, which is made up of two chemical strands that has got a bases that encode the genetic code. And that produces RNA which produces proteins, and those proteins basically do all the processes in the cell, including all the metabolism. So it basically provides the code for life. Now, we do have RNA viruses and there's various other reactions, but this, for most of the stuff, this is, we go DNA, RNA, protein. But we do have variants in this code. And one of these is called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, and they're single base variants in the DNA code as shown here, just a single change. But there's many other DNA variants, which include insertions of short segments of DNA, deletions, variable number tandem repeats, or VNTRs, or copy number variants, or CNVs. And copy number variants are where large segments of DNA have been changed, and you can get duplications and variable number of copies, either of whole genes, partial genes, or even regulatory regions. So that's what the natural variation is and what the batchal process is. So what's the problem? A public perception commonly is there's no GE in New Zealand. However, there is, but it's regulated under an act. And the key thing is that it's done mainly in containment, and there's been no release in over 25 years. However, some overseas food, greater than 80 different products, and other geo products do come in, and they may or may not be labelled by the food standards of Australia and New Zealand under section 1.5.2, but it's usually that they're labelled if it's greater than 1%. There's also medical products of genetic engineering imported. There's about 30 of them. One of these is insulin used for diabetics, but in some cases also genetically modified live attenuated vaccines as well. And one of these is for Japanese encephalitis, and that comes in under the Medicines Act in 1981. The problem is we need to create and use genetically modified organisms to solve pressing problems in New Zealand. So just how much natural variation is there? Well, typically mutation occurs in mammals at about 2 in every billion base pairs per year. But there's some caveats about that. The sheep genome's about 2.7 billion base pairs, and they've got a generation length of 3 years. So each animal will probably have about 18 new SNPs per generation. But there's 1,000 sheep in the world, mostly female, and they probably have a progeny each year, or one or more progeny. So that's 18 billion new variants every year. Now that's a lot more than there's bases of DNA in the sheep genome. In our work, we've detected about 70 million SNPs, and about 3% of the genome is copy number variants, and we've only looked at a few hundred sheep. So while we have to be careful about these figures, we can confidently assume that every base in the sheep genome has been mutated naturally. This suggests targeted methods like CRISPR are very unlikely to cause any problems greater than what's already occurring naturally. Some more numbers. New Zealand imports about 13% are food, and about 68% are food for exports, and it's about 80% of the total is primary production. This has been changing quite a bit because of COVID. It's not clear, but a considerable component of the food eaten in New Zealand is from imports. And New Zealand exports are largely niche products and from niche species, except for dairy. And the key point I want to take about this is we eat a lot of imported products, but our exports are largely dependent on homegrown research in these species, and we need all the tools in the tool basket to remain competitive. So where is gene editing in the global overview of legislation? Well, basically New Zealand's in the minority here. Unfortunately, CRISPR gene editing has dropped off the New Zealand political agenda. And often EU restrictions are mentioned, but of our exports, only about 3% of those are food products that go to the EU. It's really pretty small now. And even the EU is revisiting this issue. There's press releases all the time about, particularly about how the United Kingdom is going to allow genome edited species without regulation as under what's called genetically modified organisms. So how much crops are there that are a result of genetic engineering right now? Well, there's a lot, and it's increasing. They take up about 14 times all of New Zealand's farmland for just 5 crops. And obviously New Zealand, when I say farmland, I'm meaning all the stuff that's just grazed and can't be cropped. So what's a recent example in New Zealand? Well, I'm going to pick COVID vaccines. All of these that are available are products of genetic engineering. And for the Pfizer one that's in New Zealand, or one of the ones that's available in New Zealand, the first stage involves the molecular cloning of DNA plasmids that code for the spike protein by infusing them into bacteria. And another one is Johnson & Johnson, replication incompetent recombinant adenovirus type 26 vector expressing severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 spike protein. So all the vaccines for COVID are products of genetic engineering, and the speed and specificity of the vaccine production would not have been possible without genetic engineering. We need similar tools to address problems like methane emissions from sheep, say via a vaccine, which research is being done now. And I just really want to show here that the current mRNA vaccines that are being used in New Zealand for COVID-19 have an arm that revolves around genetic engineering, but they also have arms around other biotechnology and immunology and microbiology of research. So a list of a few of the New Zealand opportunities. Well, one of these is to speed up breeding. So earlier flowering in woody plants to reduce generation interval. For instance, pine trees have very long generation intervals. There's specific changes, gene editing to assist for facial eczema resistance in sheep, or a heat tolerance in cattle, like this bull here with the SLIC gene that's being naturally introgressed. Polled mutation in goats for human health and welfare, as well as the animals, or short-tailed sheep that don't get dags and therefore fly strike, so health and welfare. So introgression of a variant normally takes about 15 years in sheep, and this can be reduced markedly to just a few years using gene editing. And there are other variations about distributing genes as well. Many species have issues around the dissemination of genetics as well. So what about that speeding up breeding? Another piece is just new traits, reducing wilding pines, for example, by having altering their ability to spread seeds. Introduce predator populations via gene drives. Improved grazing plants that need less nitrogen and phosphorus, that have altered composition for produce faster growth and lower greenhouse gas production by grazing animals. And then there's new biological industries. If we had a vaccine for methane emissions in ruminants, it would be very valuable around the world. Just getting on to this, there's been science input into the debate, and I just want to raise this right here, that the Royal Society of New Zealand has actually done quite a lot on this. It prepared a series of papers in 2016 around these technologies. And again, in 2019, it gave specific examples. And I put one up here about gene editing scenarios in the primary industries. And all of these are, including the analysis of the New Zealand legal and regulatory framework, all of these are available for the casual reader to go and have a look at. And I encourage people to do so. So in summary, yes, genetic engineering, its products are widely used in New Zealand. In research and diagnostics, GE products are ubiquitous. So the COVID test that a lot of you probably have already done uses GE products to do that test. Imported human health products, insulin, many imported food products. What has not happened is the potential development and release of GE-modified microbes, plants, and animals in New Zealand. And we need to utilize this technology to better address some of our most pressing issues. This is invasive species, greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, better and faster adaptation to climate change and disease, and new biological industries that have lower and more sustainable resource use. So new style CRISPR gene editing speeds up combining variants already present in nature, and as such, regulations should be modified to be more in line with our overseas markets. And I think it's time for a sensible discussion to commence, because we are now facing disruptive challenges to our major exports. Research and implementation have long lead times, and many of the problems and species are specific to New Zealand and will only be financed and funded by New Zealand to address them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And let me continue by introducing Ian Proudfoot to the stage. And I will actually do that like this. Ian works for KPMG, and he is the global head of agribusiness for KPMG. So he has been already doing that since I think 2013, and he is leading the network of the KPMG professionals globally, more than 50 countries. And in New Zealand, he is very much one of the leading strategic thinkers when it comes to agribusiness. He is also the lead author of the award-winning KPMG Agribusiness Agenda, which I can really recommend you picking it up. And one of the things that we discussed in that was genetic engineering, hence the fact that we invited Ian to talk to us. Ian, I will stop sharing and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wim, and thank you for the opportunity to have a chat this morning. So I will share my screen quickly. Just bring that onto full. Let's start. Cool. So good morning, everybody, and it's a great opportunity to have a chat about my perspective on what we're seeing in relation to gene editing and I suppose wider biotechnologies. And the way I'm going to approach this, and I'll say at the outset, KPMG holds no strong view either way as to whether New Zealand should or should not take a G track or gene editing track. What we are very, very supportive of and believe is absolutely critical is having a mature conversation about these issues at the right level, involving government, involving the science sector, involving our companies, and involving our community. And I suppose ultimately what we want to see is New Zealand having a prosperous, accessible, sustainable, and I suppose fully inclusive food system. And gene editing in other countries is creating a system that is more inclusive. So it is something we believe should be part of the conversation. But really the journey I'm going to take you on this morning, I think it's important first to put some context around where we are, and then maybe go a little bit more into some of the specific themes and issues. And some of them will pick up and explore what John's already touched on. But as a starting point, I think you need to recognize that we live in a world today that's incredibly unstable, what we're calling the VUCA squared world. So a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, but it's more than just VUCA. And that's as a result of everything that's happened over the last 18 months and continues to happen. So we live in this world where things are happening faster, they're happening more unpredictably than they have in the past. And for all of us, that creates some areas where we need to be able to respond. So if you think about the pictures here, each of them has a story behind them. So the first one obviously is the capital, early in January this year. And what we're talking about there is geopolitical instability and how that's impacting on the behavior of individual governments. And what we're seeing globally is a trend in governments to become more domestically focused, to look at their own national interests in advance or in priority over a more plurilateral view that many countries have taken over the period since the end of the Second World War. And I think that the trend there from a food system perspective is we need to be recognizing that actually countries are taking initiatives to prioritize and develop priority to looking as to how they address imports. So for us as an exporting nation, we need to be very alert to that. Probably the most obvious issue we face, and I was actually had the opportunity to be on a call with Al Gore last week, and he was talking about the G2, the relationship between America and China. And you're either part of one team or you're part of another team. And for New Zealand, how we sit and balance ourselves between those two teams means we're walking a very, very thin track with many, many risks. But it is critical for us to have access to markets and to make sure that we do manage those geopolitical insecurities between countries. And that will come through into how countries expect us to interact with the science they deploy in their own markets. So if they're deploying GE technologies, how do we think about the deployment of those technologies? If we're not on board, that may create issues for us. Secondly, we sort of touched on the area that John's covered off is around health. And for us, what the pandemic has unlocked, firstly, from a GE perspective, it has given a very clear connection of the vaccine to people because we're all getting vaccinated. In fact, my wife is off in an hour to go and get a jab. But the reality is that, we are living in a world where we're all engaging, and many of us willingly engaging in a GE product. But from a food system perspective, what the pandemic has done is connected people much more clearly to their health. And it's also highlighted that as a world, the health system we've deployed, a curative-based healthcare system that makes people better when they get sick, but ignores what happens until they arrive at the hospital sick, isn't a system we can sustain because we need to stop people getting sick in the first place. We need to manage those non-communicable diseases like heart disease, obesity, diabetes. So we believe over the next 10, 15 years, we will see a pivot from curative health to preventative health. And that will be focused much more on what people put into their bodies and what the attributes of the food that people put into their bodies are. We will see, business to doctor type structures. We will see food as a prescription. And all of that unlocks actually what's the functional nature of food, which I think will again focus us in onto how we produce that food and what is the science that is able to deliver to people. And I think again, that will make us have to think more about how we use genetic engineering. The third picture there is about international trade, and you'll be very aware the trade systems that we deal with at the moment are under significant stress. But what we are seeing is countries are looking to do trade with people that have aligned values to themselves. So the concept of trade for good is becoming very important. And from New Zealand's perspective, we have always had the view that the way we produce our food ensures that we can continue to get market access. I think as John pointed out in his comments, there is now the potential that with people's perspectives changing and people starting to think about what is good and what is ethical, that actually some of the discussion and some of the assumptions we've made that a GE-free product assures us access may actually start to pivot, and it could actually become a problem for us, a constraint on our ability to export, as opposed to a driver of our ability to export. It's going along the bottom row. The first picture on the bottom row is a picture of Motueka on Boxing Day. And that's to point to the fact that, you know, we are living in a world where we're facing quite significant climate uncertainty and climate volatility. And I think, you know, the good thing when I look globally is that we have a major alignment between government, civil society, communities, that actually we've got to do something about climate change. And it's probably only in the last year or so that alignment has become incredibly clear. But that while it's really positive that, you know, we now have a collaborative move towards action, the challenge is everybody sees action in a different way. So what we're going to have to ensure is our action aligns with what people consider to be good action, the right action to help address climate change, as opposed, and if we decide to take our own track, and we can already see this appearing in how we're thinking about methane gas compared to how other countries are thinking about methane gas, we need to be able to argue our case and ensure that what we're doing is ticked off as being something that is climate positive for society as a whole, as opposed to just being the right thing for us to do. So from my perspective, I think, you know, we will need to think very much about how we deploy some of these technologies that are becoming available to us into our climate challenge, and how, therefore, I think that creates some very interesting issues. Sixth mega theme for us is around data, and I'm not going to dwell on that too long, but, you know, fundamentally there's two key issues to think about. What's data? How are you keeping your data secure, and how are you maintaining sovereignty over your data? And both of those issues are constantly under attack. You know, we're seeing quite significant amounts of cyber activity at the moment. It's been amazing during lockdown how much there has been. But more importantly, you know, we are starting to see New Zealand companies think about where they're putting their data, so they've got the right to secure that data. And I think, you know, that's going to be important as we think about building business models that will engage with people around the world, but also how we think about the data that we need to do our research. Where does it live? How are we certain we've got access to it? How do we know our data is going to give us the right answers? Because if we can't get systems in place to secure that, it will make life difficult for us. Then the final picture is a Black Lives Matter image from last year's protests. And really, the reason I've got that picture there is because we have a world that has recognized that it now is riddled with inequality and inequity. And I think that's really only become an issue that goes beyond government over about the last year or two. And the work KPMG's done now suggests many CEOs are looking at this issue from, you know, a purpose issue as a key business issue. They are either part of the solution to some of these challenges we've got, like inherent racism in society, or the inequity and inaccess of food, or to food, or they're part of the problem. And being part of the problem is not a good place to be. So if you think about that from a food system perspective, you know, and I had the pleasure last week of spending time on the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Development Goals work around the UN General Assembly. If you think about it from an SDG lens, you know, if you take zero hunger, we've got 690 million people around the world that are currently hungry. The questions coming to the food system, what are you doing about that? How can you say you're successful when you're leaving that many people out? From a health perspective, we've got 13% of adults who are obese and 340 million children. The question's coming again, what are you doing about that? How can you be a successful industry when you're ignoring or creating these problems through what people are eating? You can say the same about women. You know, 48% of our working population in the global food system is female. Yet they are the lowest paid workers on average. They are the workers that are given least opportunity to develop. That inequity is being challenged, as is the access to water, as is the wasting of food, as is the degradation that we're having on our soils. And all of these issues, people are saying, well, what solutions do you have coming? How do you become part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem? And the challenge is very direct and very blunt, I think, to the sector. And that is really causing us to start to think about, well, what do our consumers expect from us? And therefore, how do we build out a solution that enables us to meet consumer expectation and maintain our relevance? So if you think through, and it seems like a long time now, but if you go back to start of 2020, the days before COVID, what were the issues we were talking about? Well, if you think about broad issues, we were talking about the emergence of novel products, new types of milks, plant-based milks, cellular milks, all these sort of new technologies being driven by an agenda of better animal welfare, better environmental footprint, people wanting to have more choice. And that's, I picked up that picture back end of 2019 in the UK when I was surprised to see Costa Coffee with, one of their promotion stories across British national newspapers was, we're not charging a premium for plant-based milks anymore. We were talking about the story that underlies products, the connection to provenance and traceability. And the picture of the Colgate box was one that really brought that home to me. Colgate, I make no connection at all to the farmer, but the fact is that connecting a product to a farmer gives it credibility. It gives it something that people can't get. There's a degree of trust in a farmer. So Colgate are connecting their toothpaste to American mint farmers, which I just blew me away when I saw that in the supermarket. The bottom row, we were talking about sustainability, and that's still incredibly important to us as a pair of Allbirds, and Allbirds' story has continued to become a fantastic story. And obviously, they're in the process now of preparing their IPO on the NASDAQ with the intention of valuing the company at many billions of dollars. And that's, I suppose, a connection and demonstrating if you can connect the consumer to a sustainable product story, you can create real value. We were talking about the role of digitalization in our systems, and that's, and how we use AI and big data and bring together all that information to create better outcomes. So we only do what we need to do and use the resources we need to use. And again, what resources do we choose to use to enable us to do that? And then I was talking a lot at that time about the role of the consumer and how important it is that we understand the consumer. And from my perspective, the way we had started to think about that was not having the consumer at the end of a value chain, but having the consumer in the center of a value web. So regardless of where you sit in a production system, whether you're the government regulating, the research institute doing the science, whether you're a community that grants a license to operate, you are all as important as the farmer, the manufacturer, the distributor, the retailer, in terms of delivering the product the consumer is looking for. And the fact is, we live in a connected world, so the consumer can make connections to all these components to understand the environment. And I think that brings me to the core of my message here, is when we're thinking about what our future is in relation to products such as gene editing, like CRISPR technologies, or using some of the genetic modification technologies, we should always be using it with a lens of what will help us better deliver to the end consumer of our product. And if we're meeting their needs and understanding what's driving their purchase decisions, that will enable us to capture value. And in the end, for New Zealand, we're a small part of a very big global food system. Our role is really to ensure that we do capture that value and enable us to sustain and enhance the economic and social outcomes within our own country. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the last few weeks is actually, what will the global food system look like into the future? And I've concluded that what I think we're looking at is a 3-lane food system. So the first lane is what I would call the augmented subsistence farming. So that's about bringing the technologies we already use effectively, and a lot of these are genetic technologies, to play in helping the communities that grow food largely for them to consume themselves to do that better, so they can have more resilience in their food system and they can deploy digital technologies to have better nutrition in what they produce, and they can do it and create more a security for their own communities. If you think about it, that part of the food system will probably feed at the moment around about 2 billion people. That number will go down over time if we're successful, but it's about taking technologies that are generally and commonly used across much of the rest of our agricultural system and making them scaled and appropriate to fit the requirements of the communities that have been more vulnerable in terms of their access to food. The second lane, as I see it, is what I would call the modern food system. It's the new mass market system. It's probably going to feed about 5 billion people. It's represented at the moment by things like the Impossible Whopper or the Beyond Meat products. But it goes well beyond that into a whole range of new plant-based products, into a range of cultured products, of fermented products. And it is about how you can produce food that's nutritionally valid at a low cost to feed the wide population. From my perspective, this is part of the food system that will become absolutely synonymous with the use of genetic technologies over time. Because inherently, things like the Impossible Whopper, although the story doesn't make that necessarily clear, it has got a GE element to be able to produce that product. And I always think back, and I know Kim from Tohono's on the call, she'll remember a session we had at Stanford a few years ago when I questioned whether the Impossible Whopper was genetically modified. And we actually went back and we found that it was, despite the fact that the CEO of the company, the founder of the company, had been in and talked to the group and had convinced them it was the greatest product since sliced bread. But the reality is that this is going to be a part of our future. It's going to evolve incredibly quickly, and it's going to scale through the major players in the food system. So understanding how we interact with that, even if we don't necessarily want to play in all aspects of it, is going to be really important. And then the third final lane of the food system is actually the smallest. And it's what I would refer to as the modern regenerative, or if you want, just the regenerative part of the food system. And, you know, it's probably the part that New Zealand will largely play in. It's about producing food better, producing food, traditional food, in a way that is very aligned to the constraints and capacity of the land to produce. It's about using technology, but there is often a view that it's not about using genetics. And my view is actually, it may well be about using genetics if the ethics of the customers that we want to sell to are expecting us to use those technologies. So again, it comes back to what will be used in that stream will largely depend on what the customer wants, needs, and expects. So if you think about that, I think therefore we are looking at a food system that globally will be starting to deploy these technologies. So actually, what are our signals to the future? The first to me is probably quite clear, is that the solutions for defining challenge will change the ethical debate around how genetic products are used. And we need to have, that's why I say it's so important. And I said at the start, we have a mature conversation around these issues. Because if we don't have that mature conversation, we could well find ourselves on the wrong side of the ethical debate. And if that's where we are, regardless of what streams we've got, we will not have a market to sell our products to. Second signal for me came from talking to one of our big dairy exporters. And they made the comment to me that they would lose no customers if New Zealand adopted GM. They say their customers that they sell to are sophisticated enough already to understand the GM and the GE and the gene editing debate. And they view and they recognize that this is a broad church of technologies. We have different parts of those technologies can be used quite comfortably alongside each other. And they said, you know, we need to recognize that our consumers can make their own decisions. We shouldn't be trying to make the decisions for them. And the ability, therefore, to ensure that we actually meet their needs is more important than necessarily trying to decide what their needs are and make the decision for them. And I think John's already made the point very clearly, so I won't dwell on this. You know, can we remain competitive without these technologies? I think that's going to be a big question. In some cases, that competition may not just be in terms of yield, it may actually be in terms of product attribute. Have we got the attributes that will enable us to get the ticket to play in the premium market if we're not using these technologies? I don't think we've asked that question and understood that to the extent we need to, with some really forward-thinking foresight being brought into that conversation. I think there's also a really important question about, you know, what do we need to do to access the best brains, the best people to solve the problems that we need to solve in this country? My sort of take on that is, if we're not giving them the ability to use the best technology that's available in the world, we put ourselves at real risk of actually being able to do what we need to do. And therefore, we may not be able to solve the problems we think we can solve if we can't access the science capability we need to do that. I think there is a counter to this, and there is a valid argument that actually for New Zealand, what we should focus on is amplifying what we're really good at, which is free range, non-GM, natural production. And we should double down on that strategy and really try and tell the story hard and sell the story at a premium. And, you know, there is definitely some argument to that. And you can see that is something that needs to be explored. If we can demonstrate that doing that will create the most value, it will still deliver us a sustainable, accessible and robust, resilient food system, then that may well be our answer. But I think it's important to recognize, actually, I don't think there is one answer. And I think when you look internationally, systems coexist and people use GM and they can do organic and they can do that very close or almost next to each other. So I believe that ultimately there's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all answer. Parts of the country may choose to be GM free. Other parts of the country may choose to use it. I think we can find a way, and we've got enough capability in this country to work out, actually, how do we create a food system that enables us to deliver to the needs of our consumers while ensuring that we don't do things that as a country we're not comfortable with doing? Just means that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution here. So if you think about it, we're moving into a world that we've called the great big beautiful tomorrow in our agenda this year. And we do believe that biotech and gene editing is a critical debate to have if we're going to move into that. We've got to work out how we therefore have that conversation in a mature way, because otherwise the other things that we believe that will help us form that great big beautiful tomorrow, the digital acceleration we need to create digital front doors to our businesses, the recognition that 93% of our economic area is ocean, and that we won't achieve our aspirations in terms of the environment without reflecting and thinking very seriously about how we use the blue part of our environment much more effectively. The fact that there is huge potential in bioproducts, and by huge potential, we're talking billions of dollars of potential every year, which we may be able to unlock better by deploying some genetic technologies to enable us to get more useful, more active bioproducts into our production systems. We've got to ensure equitable food access. That means we've got to have affordable food. And again, if that needs us to think about how we use genetic technologies to enable us to have resilient, secure supplies of affordable food for our population, then that's got to be part of our conversation. And we've got to be able to demonstrate to the rest of the world what we do through data. And again, that means we've got to understand our supply chains and be traceable right the way back, and be able to demonstrate where we are using these technologies and where we're choosing not to use them. So there's a lot going on. And the final point just on that slide about the flexitarian shift shouldn't be overlooked as well. I've already touched on the fact that we have got this emergence of this middle stream, the modern food system, that will be a GM-based system largely, in my personal view. So just as a final takeaway, I would just encourage you, and I've used this slide quite a lot in recent times, I think it's really, really important in this current environment, is that as leaders, you know, what we bring to the table is our knowledge and our experience. But that's not only an asset, it can be a liability. And if you think about AC looking at the world as we see it, he would probably see it quite differently. Best good example of that is you look at cars traveling around in a city like Los Angeles. You know, ET would see a car being driven to the office and being left in the car park for the day next to his friend, same car as it parked to the day before, while the person that drove it there rushes around and is incredibly busy. Then he'd see the car getting driven home again in the evening, being tucked up in the garage, his Tesla probably being plugged in, while again the person that drove it home rushes around, organizes the kids, gets ready for the next day tomorrow. ET would look at the world and say the car's in charge, because they're the one with the easy life, and the person driving the car is the one doing all the work. The reality is, you know, we see the world in the way that we've been trained to see it. And that means we assume at the moment that the world is exactly as it's been in the past, or it will work as it has in the past. We've got to be able to overcome that educated incapacity and see the world as it is today, look at the world through aliens' eyes and interpret what's in front of us by looking and understanding, because the world is not the same as it was 6 months ago. It's definitely not the same as it was 18 months ago. And it's not going to be the same again moving forward. There is a new normal. So the reality is seeking diverse opinions, getting ourselves so that we understand what is in front of us, what our consumers need now, not what they needed 6 months ago or 12 months ago, is really important. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for having the opportunity, but I think this is such an important conversation.
Ian, thank you very much. And John is back as well. Guys, amazing. Thank you so much. John started off with telling us that genetic engineering is already in New Zealand, and that we can actually utilize genetic engineering to start address pressing issues. He then took us a little bit of a biochemistry / molecular biology lesson to actually explain to us what it actually was. And then coming to a conclusion that some of the genetic engineering technologies versus the variations that we see if we let animals mate naturally are actually a nice contrast. Basically, a lot of variation is occurring very naturally. John flagged that genetic engineering is no longer on the New Zealand agenda, and that is quite a concern to us, especially if you put it then in context that a limited amount of our food products are actually going to Europe. Europe being one of these countries that is embracing a GMO-free status. But now, even within the EU, it's on the agenda to actually have this discussion. And John is basically flagging that there are many opportunities for New Zealand moving forward. Then we were in the capable hands of Ian, that basically said, listen, if anything happens out of this is that we need to have a mature discussion about this. We need to look at every side of the coin before we make a decision, and that is quite hard because we're actually living in a changing environment. And like Ian ended up with, yesterday is nothing like today, and tomorrow is nothing like the rest as well. So we constantly need to evolve, which is what genetic engineering could help us with. But then we need to look at the functional nature of food and the role that GE would actually have in that. And if you then look at GE, is it then an inhibitor or a driver for export? So those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves while putting the consumer in the center of our matrix. and trends are actually telling us that GE will have part in that in some form or another. So we need to have that mature conversation, and hopefully this webinar is a contribution to that, where we actually link the value that we are seeing in our food value chains to the drive for an answer. Should we embrace genetic engineering, yes or no? Realizing that one size will not fit all. So this is a little bit a summary of what our two wonderful speakers were actually talking about, but it also gave all the participants a little bit of time to redigest what was being told and come up with some questions. And I have two questions in the Q&A box, but I definitely ask all the participants that want to ask questions, feel free to put a question in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to actually read it up. You got so the first question is for John. John, is it possible to open up New Zealand to more GE applications while still protecting our organics industry?
I would have to say yes. Obviously, genetic engineering is a very wide range of technologies, but a lot of what we've been talking about, and Ian mentioned it as well, if you combine digital technology with the tracking and tracing through the genomic technologies, for instance, you can have good traceability for organic products. And so I think that they can coexist.
Thank you very much, John. Ian, there is a question for you. Can any commodity products be produced completely sustainably and at the same time without GE? For example, milk powder or beef?
I think if we are producing milk powder or beef without GE, ultimately on a global basis, we're not actually going to be producing a commodity product. I think, you know, the technologies will become so widespread internationally that we would need to be really focused in delinking our products from the commodity market and actually highlighting that their attributes. And that's why I think, you know, we will see the emergence of this modern regenerative track as part of the global food system. But even then, I think, you know, and it's something like, say, use of pasture. If we're not using a pasture that has the ability to help maybe reduce methane emissions from an animal, when that's available to us, then I think, you know, we will find it very hard to sell our products as anything if we're not using the technologies that are available. So I think it's really important we do ensure that we are thinking about all aspects of our production system to determine how we design the system.
Thank you very much, Ian. And while I'm waiting for some more questions to come in, I have a question for the two of you, John, Ian, because John basically made the point, well, we need to get this, it's no longer on the New Zealand agenda, so it needs to be being put back onto that New Zealand agenda. Ian, you are saying that we need to have a mature discussion about that. I think my interpretation is that both of you are basically saying the same thing, right? We need to put it on the agenda. We need to talk about it in a mature way. My question is to each of you, how can we do that? How can we put this back on the agenda? And I'll start with John.
Well, I think it's most likely to be driven not by GE itself, but be driven by addressing problems that New Zealand needs to face. And perhaps I'm biased here because I've worked for about 12 years in the greenhouse gas area. I think that's a very large problem. It's going to be around and really test our export industries. And there are a variety of opportunities where genetic engineering can address at least some of those issues. And so I think it'll be probably driven by that. But what's not happening at the minute is it's not being pushed to the forefront as one of the potential solutions.
Thank you, John. Ian.
I think actually the driver for the conversation has got to come from the corporate sector, probably. I think, they ultimately are the people that are responsible for directly interacting with our consumers. They have the greatest connection to market signals that are coming back to them around how consumers are thinking about these sort of issues. And I think also that, they are aligning and looking for how do they achieve a transition to a lower carbon future. And, they've got a legal obligation to be thinking about that under the Zero Carbon Act. So I think as an initiator of that conversation, if we wait on the politicians to do it, we'll be waiting an incredibly long time. But I do believe that if our companies and the science sector can come together and start that conversation, the politicians will have no choice but to join.
Thank you very much, Ian. In the meantime, I have another question coming in for John. John, from a consumer point of view, what are the biggest pushbacks using GE products? Is it mainly surrounding ethics?
Actually, Ian probably should answer that rather than me. I think that the debate started about 40 years ago, and it was at that time it was a new area. The risks were unknown as well as the opportunities. We've been going more than 40 years now, and I think that the risks and opportunities are much more clearly defined. But a lot of people are still very wedded to the situation as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. Knowledge in these technologies and just general knowledge about the genomes of the various animals and species has advanced enormously over the last 40 years, but I don't think the debate has moved very far.
What do you think, Ian? Is this very much like an ethics issue, or?
Yeah, I think to me, it absolutely is an ethics issue, but I think, and it's actually an education issue as well, because I think when people become informed, and it's very clear that there are influencers overseas that were staunchly anti-GM, that having been informed about what these technologies can do to help us provide greater food resilience, help us address climate change, help address some of the other significant challenges we face in terms of our biodiversity globally, that have changed their perspective around whether they should be used or not. So there is a real education issue. And if you think about New Zealand, last time that there was any sort of national debate at a sort of significant policy setting level was when we were talking about a debate that was really revolving around cisgenics and transgenics. So really, technologies that are a number of generations behind now the sort of technologies that John's talking about. And I think, we put one label really across the whole thing in terms of genetic modification or genetic editing, whereas what we're actually talking about is a huge diversity of different science and different technologies, which, you're never going to be able to explain all of them to the wider community. But at the moment, we make it very easy for them to connect, something that probably most of us wouldn't be too comfortable with, which is some of the significant transgenic type products that were being talked about at the sort of start of this century. And they just apply that to everything, not the really sophisticated targeting gene editing type technologies. So I think, you know, whereas we educate people, they start to understand more about what we can do with science, and that unlocks a lot of opportunities for us.
Thank you very much. There is a question, Ian, for you, and I'll read it up. Ian, to clarify, do you think environmental sustainability credentials will be more important than a GE-free status in offering premium priced products overseas?
I think when you look at it, you need to look at what market you're trying to sell to. We did some work in this year's agenda where we went through a number of different markets, and the attributes that are important to different consumers in different markets are markedly different. But what I can tell you is in very few cases were GE very close to the top of the list of a critical attribute of GE-free status. So in some cases, sustainability metrics were more important. In other cases, it was traceability and provenance that was more important. In some cases, it's the experience that's delivered. So how can you create a great product? In all cases, price is important. So I think, you know, what we're looking at is not one consumer, but we're looking at 1 billion or 1 million different consumer niches. So understanding what's right for each of those individual niches is really important if we're going to unlock the value from a product. But we can't say generically that GE is an issue for every consumer, because it's not.
Thank you so much. We have another question coming in, not really directing to anybody specific, so feel free to jump in. What are the requirements from the food producer side when it comes from the transparency surrounding GE products? Do these differ between consumer and commercial markets?
I'd like Ian to answer this, but I'll just bring up a little point. Is obviously under the food standards issue, that there is a what form it takes, but particularly how much is in it and the actual traceability. And there was quite a large conversation about refined oils or products that may only make up a very small proportion of a product. And I think that all I'm really trying to say here is I think that it's not just black and white. There's a very large grading, and this makes the conversation complicated. So Ian, I'll get you to follow up.
Yeah, I think the conversations we have with international companies, you know, cover a whole range of attributes in products, and you know what they're looking for. What they're all looking for, without any doubt, is really robust traceability that tells them, you know, provides data to support the provenance of a product. And I think we cannot underplay how important traceability and digital traceability of products is going to be moving forward, because that really is your ticket to play in that, you know, where the product comes from. But what a lot of the companies we're talking to are talking about various attributes, and that, you know, they are looking to buy products that have particular levels of an attribute inherent within them. So it may be a particular level of carbon associated with its production, or it may be that they are wanting to produce a product that's going to go into a particular range or brand that they have that's a GM-free brand. So in that case, they're looking for a GM-free brand. But that may be a small part of their portfolio, and on another case, they're quite happy to buy a brand that's got a genetic element to it if it's going to help them keep the cost down, because they're targeting that at the mass market. So I think, you know, what we're seeing is actually what's really important to them is having certainty about the quality and robustness of the information that underlies a product. And then they will make their own decisions how that fits within their product portfolio. But if you can't give them that data integrity, it's going to be very, very hard for them to buy your product.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, John, for this. There are no more questions coming in. So it leaves me to thank you absolutely for your contribution. and for discussing this subject. And it's very clear that it is a discussion that needs to be continued. It is a discussion that needs some thoughts around education as well, of the consumer of the different technologies, to actually pull them out of the idea that we are stuck in 40 years ago. Thank you very much, Ian, John. I will share my screen and I will tell you what Blink Innovation is up. Where are we? We are here. What we are up about in the future. On the 12th of October, we will do another innovation series, and we will tackle mental health and well-being in the New Zealand rural communities. And you probably heard it on the news, really topical as well. So again, we will discuss that with you, and you are extremely welcome to join us there. Then another VIBE event that we are organizing, that will be in our space at Lincoln University, which will be looking at machine learning in the ag sector, and we will actually do that on the 21st of October. This is it from us. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again.